The Big Red One, the oldest continuously serving division in the U.S. Army. In the fall of 1942, the 1st Infantry Division was handed a mission so secret that the soldiers didn't know where they were going until they were already at sea. The mission was called Operation Torch. The plan was to secretly land on the coast of North Africa under the cover of darkness, in territory controlled by Vichy France, the French government that had allied with Nazi Germany. The problem was, nobody knew whether the French soldiers stationed there would fight back or lay down their arms. The entire operation was a gamble. The 1st Infantry Division shipped out from England in October 1942, crossing the Atlantic through waters crawling with German U-boats. Over 40,000 troops were headed for the Algerian port city of Oran. At 1 in the morning on November 8th, the soldiers hit the beaches. The landing points were codenamed Beach Z and Beach Y, positioned on either side of Oran. Some beaches saw no resistance at all. Others were met with gunfire from French coastal batteries. French commanders were confused. They didn't know whether to follow Vichy orders or welcome the Americans as liberators. Within 48 hours, the 1st Infantry Division had captured Oran, seized key airfields, and established the first Allied foothold in North Africa. It was the first time American soldiers had engaged in the European theater. The lessons from Operation Torch: nighttime landings, coordinating with naval forces, managing the chaos of hitting an unknown beach, became the blueprint for a much bigger invasion 2 years later on a beach called Omaha. The Big Red One went from secret midnight beaches in Algeria to the most famous beach in history, but none of it happens without that first invisible landing. The 10th Mountain Division was literally built for impossible terrain. Created during World War II to fight in the Italian Alps, these soldiers trained on skis and snowshoes in the mountains of Colorado before being shipped to Europe. But the mission that defined the modern 10th Mountain had nothing to do with Italy. In late 2001, the United States invaded Afghanistan, and the terrain was some of the most brutal on the planet. In March 2002, the 10th Mountain was sent into the Shah-e-Qat Valley for Operation Anaconda. The mission: destroy the Al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters entrenched in the mountain caves. The enemy was dug into fortified cave positions above 10,000 feet. Soldiers were fighting in freezing temperatures, thin air, and under constant ambush from higher ground. What made this operation different was the invisible hand of the CIA. American intelligence operatives had been working with Afghan militia forces for months before the 10th Mountain arrived. The plan was for the militia to push the enemy into a trap, and the 10th Mountain would be the hammer. But the Afghan forces pulled back under heavy fire, and suddenly the 10th Mountain soldiers were the ones caught in the kill zone, exposed on open ground with enemy fighters shooting down from the ridgelines. For 17 straight days, the division fought at altitude, calling in airstrikes on cave positions and clearing enemy bunkers one by one. Apache helicopters took so many hits that crews started calling the valley the Bowl. 8 Americans were killed and over 80 wounded. But Operation Anaconda shattered Al-Qaeda's conventional fighting capability in eastern Afghanistan. The division, born in the Italian Alps, found its modern identity in the mountains of Afghanistan, proving that when the terrain is supposed to be impossible, the 10th Mountain treats it like home. On the night of June 5, 1944, over 13,000 American paratroopers loaded into transport planes across England. They were about to make the largest airborne assault in history, and they were doing it in total darkness. The 82nd Airborne Division's mission was to drop behind German lines in Normandy, hours before the beach landings began. They needed to seize bridges, block roads, and capture the town of Sainte-Mère-Église to prevent the Germans from reinforcing the coast. General Eisenhower visited the paratroopers before takeoff. He knew the casualty predictions were devastating. Some staff officers estimated 70% losses among the airborne forces. Shortly before midnight, over 1,000 C-47 transport planes took off and crossed the English Channel at low altitude to avoid German radar. The paratroopers sat in darkness, listening to the engines. Then everything went wrong. As the planes crossed the French coast, they hit a thick cloud bank and came under intense anti-aircraft fire. Pilots broke formation, climbed, dove, and scattered across the sky. When the green light came on, paratroopers jumped, but most landed miles from their drop zones. Small groups of soldiers from different units found themselves lost in the hedgerow country of Normandy, in the dark, surrounded by Germans. The chaos actually worked in the Americans' favor. The Germans couldn't figure out where the main attack was coming from because the paratroopers were scattered everywhere. German commanders were paralyzed. They had no idea what they were facing. Despite being scattered, the 82nd Airborne captured Sainte-Mère-Église in the early hours of June 6th, making it one of the first towns liberated on D-Day. One paratrooper, Private John Steele, famously got his parachute caught on the church steeple and hung there pretending to be dead. By morning, the airborne troops linked up with the soldiers landing on Utah Beach. The 82nd fought for 33 straight days in Normandy and never gave up a single inch of ground they'd taken. The night drop into Normandy was messy, terrifying, and nothing went according to plan, but it worked. And the 82nd Airborne proved that even when everything falls apart, paratroopers find a way. After the fall of Baghdad in April 2003, Saddam Hussein and his inner circle vanished. The US military's top priority became finding them, and Saddam's two sons, Uday and Qusay, were near the top of the most wanted list. Uday was the ace of hearts. Qusay was the ace of clubs. Uday ran the Fedayeen Saddam paramilitary force. Qusay controlled the Republican Guard. Killing or capturing them was about more than justice. It was about breaking the regime's last hope. For months, there was nothing. Then on July 21st, 2003, a man walked into a 101st Airborne base in Mosul. He was a businessman who had been hiding the brothers in his villa, and he wanted the $30 million reward. The tip was specific: exact location, descriptions, habits. By the next morning, Task Force 121, a joint special forces and 101st Airborne unit, had surrounded the house. At 10 in the morning, soldiers issued a surrender demand through a bullhorn. The response was a burst of machine gun fire from inside. Special Forces operators breached the door and entered, and walked straight into an ambush. 4 Special Forces soldiers were wounded in the first minutes. The entry team fell back. Inside, the brothers had barricaded themselves on the second floor with AK-47s and grenades. The house had reinforced concrete walls. It was a fortress. Over 200 reinforcements from the 101st Airborne surrounded the villa. They opened up with everything they had: Mark 19 grenade launchers, 50 caliber machine guns, AT-4 rockets. Kiowa helicopters strafed the building with rockets and machine gun fire. 3 hours into the battle, 10 Tau missiles were fired into the house from Humvee-mounted launchers. The building was reduced to rubble. When soldiers entered the ruins, they found Uday and Qusay dead. The raid had lasted over 4 hours. It was one of the most high-profile kills of the entire Iraq War, and the 101st Airborne was at the center of it. Major General David Petraeus, commander of the 101st, surveyed the wreckage that evening. 2 of the most wanted men on Earth had been found because one nervous informant walked into a base and asked for the reward money. By early 1945, the Japanese Empire was crumbling, but there were still thousands of American civilians and soldiers being held in prison camps across the Philippines. And the Japanese had made it clear that prisoners would be executed before they'd be rescued. On the island of Palawan, Japanese soldiers had already herded Allied prisoners into underground shelters and burned them alive. General MacArthur knew that every hour wasted meant more prisoners could be murdered. MacArthur turned to Major General Verney Mudge in the 1st Cavalry Division with the single order: get to Manila and get there fast. Save the prisoners at Santo Tomas before the Japanese could execute them. The 1st Cavalry formed what became known as the Flying Column, a stripped-down strike force of tanks, cavalry squadrons, artillery, and engineers. They carried only 4 days of rations and the bare minimum in fuel and ammunition. Starting on February 1st, the Flying Column tore south across Luzon at top speed, smashing through Japanese positions, bypassing blown bridges, and covering over 100 miles in just 66 hours. Filipino guerrillas guided the column through enemy territory, pointing out minefields and ambush positions. At the town of Cabanatuan, the column hit heavy resistance and lost their lead commander, but they never stopped moving. On the evening of February 3rd, the column reached the outskirts of Manila. A Filipino intelligence officer named Captain Manuel Colayco guided them through the darkened streets to the gates of Santo Tomas University, which the Japanese had turned into a massive internment camp. A Sherman tank nicknamed Battalion Basic crashed through the front gate. Inside were nearly 4,000 civilian prisoners, mostly Americans, who had been starving for 3 years. Many were days from death. Captain Colayco was killed by a grenade during the firefight at the gates, but the prisoners were free. When they saw the 1st Cavalry patch, the camp erupted in cheers. The Santo Tomas rescue was one of the fastest and most dramatic liberation operations of the entire war. In true cavalry fashion, the 1st Cav charged 100 miles through enemy territory and kicked down the gate. In early April 2003, Saddam Hussein's regime was broadcasting to the world that American forces were dying by the thousands, nowhere near Baghdad. The Iraqi information minister, nicknamed Baghdad Bob, stood in front of cameras and declared the Americans were committing suicide at the gates of the city. Colonel David Perkins, commanding the 2nd Brigade of the 3rd Infantry Division, decided the best way to prove Baghdad Bob wrong was to drive 100 tanks straight through the center of Baghdad. On April 5th, Task Force 164 Armor executed the first Thunder Run, a battalion-sized armored raid from the south of Baghdad, straight through the main highways, to the airport the 3rd Infantry had just captured. Iraqi resistance was disorganized. The column blasted through checkpoints and fighting positions, taking only a few casualties. One tank was hit by an RPG that set its engine on fire. The crew escaped, and the Air Force later bombed the disabled tank to prevent the Iraqis from claiming they'd won. 2 days later, the entire 2nd Brigade was ordered to do it again. Same route, but this time the Iraqis had fortified the highway. And this time, Colonel Perkins had a bigger plan. He wasn't going to drive through and come back. He was going to drive in and stay. On April 7th, the 2nd Thunder Run launched. The brigade took a wall of fire from Iraqi soldiers dug in under overpasses and highway ramps. Every single armored vehicle was hit. Some took over a dozen RPG strikes. The fighting was so intense that battalions ran out of ammunition. Medics, mechanics, and even the chaplain picked up weapons. At one intersection, a commander called in final protective fires, an artillery command only used when a unit is about to be overrun. It hadn't been used since Vietnam. Then an enemy missile hit the brigade's command post, killing 5 soldiers and wounding 20. Communications went down. The entire operation was hanging by a thread. But Perkins made the call. They were staying. The tanks shut down their engines to conserve fuel. Resupply columns fought their way through ambushes to bring ammunition. By nightfall, the 3rd Infantry Division controlled the center of Baghdad. Baghdad Bob was still on television claiming there were no Americans in Baghdad, while Abrams tanks were parked outside Saddam's palace. The Thunder Run broke the regime in a single day, and conventional military wisdom said it shouldn't have been possible. In 1966, the U.S. Army built one of its largest bases in all of Vietnam, right in the Cu Chi district northwest of Saigon. The 25th Infantry Division, nicknamed Tropic Lightning, was stationed there because they were trained for jungle warfare. Almost immediately, strange things started happening. Helicopter engines were sabotaged, food went missing, soldiers were being attacked inside the base perimeter, and nobody could figure out how the enemy was getting in. The answer was underground. Beneath the 25th Infantry's base, and stretching for over 250 miles in every direction, was an enormous network of tunnels built by the Viet Cong. The tunnels had hospitals, kitchens, bunk rooms, weapons caches, and even classrooms. The US military tried everything to deal with the tunnels. They pumped in tear gas. They filled them with acetylene and lit it on fire. They sent in dogs. Nothing worked. The tunnels were too deep and too complex, so they turned to volunteers, small-stature soldiers who were willing to crawl into pitch-black tunnels armed with nothing but a pistol, a knife, and a flashlight. They became known as the Tunnel Rats. The tunnels were rigged with booby traps, punji sticks, tripwires, and even boxes filled with scorpions and venomous snakes. In some tunnels, Viet Cong fighters were waiting in the dark with weapons. Every turn could be your last. The Tunnel Rats learned to never fire more than 3 shots before reloading, so the enemy couldn't rush them during a reload. They used red-lensed flashlights because the Viet Cong only used white light, making it easier to tell friend from enemy in the dark. In January 1967, during Operation Cedar Falls, Tunnel Rats from the 25th Infantry uncovered the Viet Cong district headquarters of Cu Chi. Inside, they found 500,000 documents, maps of US bases, military strategy plans, lists of spies, and even plans for an assassination attempt on Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. The intelligence they recovered was massive. Viet Cong codebreakers had been intercepting and decoding every radio transmission from the 1st and 25th Infantry Divisions. Once that was discovered and stopped, both divisions immediately became safer and more effective. The Tunnel Rats were never an official unit, just volunteers who chose to crawl into the dark. Their motto, in mock Latin, was Non Gratum Anus Rodentum, roughly translated as not worth a rat's ass. They didn't need a motto. They needed nerve. In June 2022, the US Army did something it hadn't done in decades. It activated an entirely new airborne division. The 11th Airborne, nicknamed the Arctic Angels, was reborn in Alaska with a single purpose: own the Arctic. The Arctic might sound like a frozen wasteland, but it's become one of the most strategically important regions on Earth. As ice caps shrink, new shipping lanes and resource deposits are opening up. And Russia has been militarizing its Arctic territory for years. The 11th Airborne soldiers trained to operate in conditions that would shut down any normal military unit. Temperatures drop to minus 40 degrees. Equipment freezes, batteries die, and soldiers still have to fight. One of their signature exercises is called Arctic Edge, a large-scale joint exercise that simulates combat operations in extreme cold and mountainous terrain. Soldiers conduct airborne jumps, long-range ski patrols, and survival operations in some of the harshest conditions on the planet. What makes the 11th Airborne different from every other division is their focus on what the Army calls extreme cold weather operations. These soldiers learn to build snow shelters, navigate whiteout conditions, and keep weapons functional when the metal is so cold it can freeze to your skin. The original 11th Airborne Division served in World War II. It was the unit that liberated the Los Baños prison camp in the Philippines with a daring parachute raid. Reactivating the division's name was deliberate, connecting modern Arctic warriors to a legacy of operating behind enemy lines. The new 11th Airborne is the only division in the U.S. Army dedicated entirely to Arctic and subarctic combat. While other units train for deserts or jungles, the Arctic Angels train for the environment where most armies simply can't function. The message is clear. If a conflict breaks out in the Arctic, the United States already has a full airborne division trained to fight, survive, and win in the coldest place on Earth. And they're not hiding. They want the world to know they're there. 8 divisions, 8 missions that change the course of history. From midnight beaches to frozen tundra. Every division in the U.S. Army has its story. These are the ones they don't put on the recruiting posters.